They said it couldn't happen. Brussels had fined Google billions. It had forced Apple to rewrite its entire app store. It had made Meta restructure its privacy architecture from the ground up. The European Commission had spent 20 years building the most powerful regulatory machine on Earth, and every single American tech giant had eventually bent the knee. Every single one. So when Elon Musk started making noise about pulling X from Europe, nobody in Brussels panicked. They had seen this movie before. They knew how it ended. The company threatens, Brussels holds firm. The company backs down, pays a fine, and life goes on. Ursula von der Leyen had personally overseen 3 of those victories. She believed the 4th would be no different. Surprised? She was catastrophically wrong, because this time the man on the other side of the table wasn't just a tech CEO trying to protect his profit margins. He was the most powerful private citizen in human history, operating with the full backing of the American presidency with a specific strategic objective that had nothing to do with advertising revenue or user data. And when Brussels gave him their answer, he didn't lawyer up. He didn't negotiate. He didn't compromise. He pressed a button, and 340 million Europeans watched their digital world go dark. The story of how X disappeared from Europe doesn't begin with Elon Musk. It begins with a mineral. Specifically, it begins with neodymium, a rare earth element so critical to modern technology that without it, electric vehicle motors cannot function, wind turbines cannot generate power, and advanced missile guidance systems cannot operate. Neodymium, along with dysprosium, terbium, and 17 other rare earth elements, sits at the absolute foundation of the 21st century economy. And right now, China controls approximately 90% of the world's refined rare earth supply. That single fact is the most dangerous economic vulnerability in the Western world, and every serious strategist in Washington has known it for decades. But knowing a problem exists and solving it are 2 entirely different things. Solving it requires access to alternative deposits large enough to actually break China's monopoly. And there is only one place on Earth where those deposits exist at the scale necessary to matter: Greenland. Beneath Greenland's ice sheet lies the largest untapped concentration of rare earth minerals on the planet. The estimates are staggering. Some geological surveys place the total value of Greenland's mineral wealth at over $25 trillion, not billions, trillions. Enough neodymium to power Tesla's entire global production for generations. Enough rare earth supply to make American technology completely independent of Chinese extraction. Enough strategic leverage to fundamentally restructure the balance of global economic power for the next 100 years. This is why Donald Trump spent his first term talking about buying Greenland. This is why his second term made Greenland the single most important foreign policy objective of his administration. And this is why Elon Musk, the man whose entire empire of Tesla, SpaceX, and Starlink runs on rare earth minerals, became the most motivated private actor in the history of American resource strategy. What most people missed, what Brussels completely failed to understand, was that Musk's interest in Greenland was not ideological. It was existential. Tesla's long-term production viability depends on securing rare earth supply chains outside of Chinese control. SpaceX rocket components require rare earth elements that China can cut off at any moment it chooses. Starlink satellites, tens of thousands of them already in orbit, with tens of thousands more planned, are built with materials that flow through Chinese-controlled supply chains. Musk had spent years quietly watching China's dominance over these materials and understanding that at some point Beijing would use that dominance as a weapon. The moment Greenland became a serious possibility, Musk stopped being a passive observer and became the most aggressive advocate for American control of Arctic resources the world had ever seen. He wasn't just lobbying for a business advantage, he was fighting for the survival of everything he had built. The European Commission understood none of this. To Brussels, the Greenland dispute was a sovereignty question, a matter of international law and democratic principle. Denmark was a European Union member state. Greenland, though self-governing, existed within the Danish realm. Any negotiation over Greenland's resources, therefore, required European oversight and European approval. Von der Leyen's position was legally coherent, institutionally consistent, and strategically suicidal, because she was applying the rules of a 20th century diplomatic framework to a 21st century conflict being waged by a man who had already decided the rules didn't apply to him. She sent legal briefs. He was building kill switches. She convened committees. He was writing code. The gap between how Brussels understood this confrontation and what was actually happening wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a civilizational mismatch. The first direct warning came in November 2025 when Musk posted a series of messages on X that most European officials dismissed as characteristic provocation. He wrote that Europe was making a historic mistake by treating American innovation as an adversary rather than a partner. He wrote that the rare earth question would define which civilizations thrived and which declined in the coming century. He wrote most ominously that platforms built for free societies had no obligation to operate inside regulatory frameworks designed to suppress them. European officials responded with statements about the Digital Services Act, about platform accountability, about the rule of law. They fundamentally misread every single word he had written. Musk wasn't complaining about regulations. He was announcing a decision he had already made. Behind the scenes, the technical preparation had begun months earlier. Engineers at X's infrastructure division had quietly begun the process of architecturally separating European server operations from the global network, not visibly, not in any way that would trigger regulatory scrutiny, but systematically and deliberately. The same process was underway at Starlink. The firmware update that would eventually brick every terminal in Europe had been written, tested, and loaded into the deployment pipeline. The notification system that would deliver the termination message to 340 million users simultaneously had been engineered with the same precision Musk applied to rocket launches. This was not a reaction. This was a plan, a detailed, technically sophisticated, months-in-the-making plan. And Brussels, with all its regulatory power and all its institutional confidence, had not the slightest idea it was coming. Von der Leyen got her first real indication that something was wrong on December 22, 2025, when a senior European Commission official received an unofficial communication from a contact inside the U.S. State Department. The communication was deliberately vague, deliberately deniable, but the message was clear. The Greenland situation had escalated beyond standard diplomatic channels. American interests were aligned at the highest levels, meaning presidential and corporate simultaneously. And Europe's continued refusal to engage substantively with the resource access question was being interpreted in Washington not as a principled stance, but as a hostile act. Von der Leyen convened a closed session of senior commissioners the following morning. The session lasted 4 hours. It produced a consensus that would prove to be the single most consequential miscalculation in the history of the European Union. The consensus was that Musk would not actually pull X from Europe because the financial cost of losing 340 million users was too great, that Starlink disruptions would constitute interference with communications infrastructure and would trigger legal consequences Musk couldn't survive, that Trump's tariff threats were negotiating theater, not genuine policy, and that holding firm was the correct strategy because Brussels had always won these confrontations before. Every single one of those conclusions was wrong. And in exactly 26 days, Europe would find out just how wrong, in the most devastating way possible. The question isn't whether Musk had the capability to do what he did. The question is why. With every warning sign screaming in their faces, the most powerful regulatory body on earth walked directly into the trap. And the answer to that question reveals something about Brussels that von der Leyen will spend the rest of her career trying to explain away. January 15th, 2026 is the date that will be studied in political science classrooms for the next 50 years. Not because of what Musk did, but because of what von der Leyen said right before he did it. At 2:15 p.m. Central European Time, standing at the official podium of the European Commission in Brussels, flanked by the flags of all 27 member states, Ursula von der Leyen delivered what her communications team had prepared as a definitive show of European strength. She said the European Union would not be held hostage by any individual, any corporation, or any foreign government. She said Greenland's resources belong to the European family of nations. She said the Commission had full legal authority to compel platform compliance and would exercise that authority without hesitation. She looked directly into the cameras with the practiced confidence of someone who had faced down American corporate power before and won. The press corps applauded. European newspapers immediately ran headlines about Brussels standing firm. Commission insiders celebrated what they believed was a masterclass in political communication. Musk watched the press conference from his office in Austin, Texas, and then he opened his laptop and typed 2 words to his core leadership team: execute severance. What followed in the next 18 hours was not a corporate withdrawal. It was a controlled demolition. The sequencing of what Musk unleashed was deliberate and psychologically precise. He did not shut everything down at once. He did it in waves, each one designed to hit a different pressure point inside the European power structure, each one arriving before Brussels had time to process the previous blow. The first wave hit at 11:47 p.m. on January 15th. Every ex-user across all 27 European Union member states received an identical push notification simultaneously. The message stated that due to irreconcilable differences with European regulatory authorities, X would permanently cease all operations in the European Union effective January 17th at midnight. It stated that the decision was final and irreversible. The notification remained on screen for 30 seconds and then vanished, leaving no trace in the notification history. But within 4 minutes, screenshots were already spreading across every other social media platform in Europe. Within 20 minutes, it was the top trending topic globally. Within an hour, European newsrooms were in full crisis mode. The Commission's press office received 340 individual media inquiries before sunrise. Von der Leyen's personal communications director was awoken at midnight and immediately understood that the morning would be unlike anything Brussels had previously managed. The second wave arrived at 2:30 a.m., and it was more brutal than the first because it didn't target politics or media. It targeted ordinary people. Starlink connections across Europe began dropping. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the specific pattern of a system being methodically shut down region by region. Rural Ireland went first, then remote areas of Scandinavia, then fishing communities along the Atlantic coast that had no alternative internet infrastructure whatsoever. By 4 a.m., the disruptions had spread across 12 member states. By 5:30 a.m., emergency services in 3 separate countries had reported communication failures in regions that depended entirely on Starlink because traditional broadband had never reached them. And then, at precisely 6 a.m., every single Starlink terminal in the European Union received a firmware update that permanently disabled the hardware. Not a service suspension, not a temporary outage. A deliberate, irreversible, hardware-level kill. Millions of Europeans who had no alternative connectivity option woke up to find themselves completely and permanently cut off. Farmers in remote Bavaria, Coast Guard stations in northern Scotland, mountain rescue teams in the Austrian Alps, medical facilities in rural Romania, all of them simultaneously severed. The European Space Agency issued an emergency statement describing the situation as an unprecedented attack on civilian communications infrastructure. But it wasn't an attack. It was a scheduled execution, and Musk had written the execution order months in advance. Von der Leyen convened an emergency session of the full European Commission at 7 a.m. on January 16th. What happened inside that room has since leaked through multiple channels, and the picture it paints of European institutional collapse is breathtaking in its completeness. The French commissioner arrived demanding immediate economic sanctions and a coordinated European response through NATO channels. The German commissioner argued that escalation would trigger further American tariff action that German industry could not survive. The Italian commissioner stated flatly that 3 regions of southern Italy were now experiencing what amounted to a humanitarian communications emergency and that Rome could not wait for Brussels' consensus. The Polish commissioner said something that landed in the room like a grenade. He said that if the Commission could not protect member states from this kind of infrastructure warfare, then member states would protect themselves individually, directly, and without waiting for Commission approval. That statement was the sound of European institutional unity beginning to fracture under pressure it had never been designed to withstand. Von der Leyen tried to restore order. She spoke about legal mechanisms, about the Digital Services Act, about emergency provisions within the EU treaty framework. One commissioner, whose identity has never been officially confirmed, reportedly interrupted her mid-sentence and said, "Ursula, he has already left. You cannot regulate a company that is no longer here. We have nothing." The meeting ended without a strategy, without consensus, and without a single concrete action item. Just the slowly spreading recognition that the most powerful regulatory body in the Western world had been outmaneuvered so completely that it didn't even have the language to describe what had just happened to it. And Musk wasn't finished, not even close. Because while the commission was sitting in that room arguing with itself, he was already loading the third wave. And the third wave wouldn't just damage Europe's digital infrastructure. It would bring the entire economic architecture of the European Union to the edge of collapse in a way that no trade dispute, no financial crisis, and no political rupture in the history of European integration had ever managed to do. What Trump announced from the White House Rose Garden at noon on January 16th made everything that came before it look like a warning shot. What Donald Trump announced from the White House Rose Garden on January 16th was not a diplomatic ultimatum. It was an economic execution order delivered with a smile. Standing behind the presidential seal, Trump imposed immediate tariffs of 60% on all European automobile imports, 50% on luxury goods, and 40% on agricultural products, effective within 48 hours. He then did something nobody in Brussels had modeled in any crisis scenario. He gave every major American technology company operating inside Europe a direct presidential ultimatum. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and Meta had 72 hours to choose between continued access to American markets and continued cooperation with European regulatory authorities. The choice was engineered to be impossible. No American technology company could voluntarily sacrifice access to the world's largest economy to preserve its relationship with Brussels. Trump knew that. Musk knew that. And within 24 hours, the answers started coming in. Google announced a review of its European operational structure. Microsoft released a statement about alignment with American foreign policy obligations. Amazon began quietly decommissioning European data centers. The tech exodus that Musk had ignited with X was now a continent-wide corporate retreat, and Europe had no mechanism to stop it, reverse it, or even slow it down. Von der Leyen appeared before cameras on the evening of January 17th. She looked like someone who had aged a decade in 48 hours. She spoke about European resilience and democratic values and the long arc of history bending toward justice. But the markets had already delivered their verdict. The DAX had collapsed 8% in a single session. The euro had fallen to levels not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. European bond yields were spiking in ways that historically preceded institutional collapse. And somewhere in Austin, Texas, Elon Musk watched the woman who had refused to negotiate stare into a camera and realize in real time and in front of the entire world that she had nothing left to bargain with. The surrender wasn't announced with a formal statement or a diplomatic communique. It came quietly through back channels, exactly the way Musk had predicted it would. But what Europe agreed to give up in those back channel conversations, and what Musk demanded in return for restoring even partial service, will redefine the balance of power between governments and technology for the rest of this century. And you are not going to believe the terms.